Crioso, and welcome back to the Welsh History Podcast, episode 243, Early Nationalism and Cymru Fydd. Before we dive into the Welsh portion of this story, let's begin by talking about and explaining nationalism. Before the rise of what we consider to be proper nationalistic movements in Britain and especially in Wales, there was movements that began long before that, and they're important to the story and they give us context. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about how nationalism really gets going. What is this concept and why is it so surprisingly modern in its context? Though people have long felt loyalty to kingdoms and tribes or religions, the idea of a group of people that share a language, a culture, and territory should form a political nation, that's largely a product of the 18th and especially the early 19th century. It begins, arguably, as most things do in the modern era, with the French Revolution of 1789. When revolutionaries overthrew the monarchy, they did so in the name of the people. Suddenly, loyalty was no longer to a king, but to a shared identity, la nation, if you will. The French declared that sovereignty belonged not to a divine ruler, but to the nation itself. This was a radical and contagious idea, and different from the American ideals about independence and liberty, in that the French ethic and revolution had a knock-on effect for all of Europe in a way that the American Revolution really didn't. It's difficult to understand, but the American Revolution was looked upon as being something that just was more of a rebellion and thus didn't have kind of a national uprising feel to it as far as a lot of European nations were concerned. And most nations were more concerned about maintaining their monarchies and maintaining the systems that had existed basically since before the feudal period. And this is the first time where we see modern statecraft suddenly become important, where the idea of loyalty no longer being to a monarch, but to a national idea suddenly becomes important. Keep in mind that in the feudal system of the past, you have a system in which you're not loyal necessarily to the overall kingdom, but you're loyal to your lord, who in turn is loyal to his monarch. And it is in that way as your loyalty builds up. Over time, of course, through common language, common culture, there is a separate loyalty that's built in within that. See Wales, for example, or even Scotland. But at the same time, you have this system of loyalties that is packed within it, which aren't as political in nature. However, post the French Revolution, nationalism spreads across Europe, partially because of the fact that the French Revolution is spreading across Europe and bringing overall change to places like Germany and Austria and Italy and to the Poles and the Hungarians, all of whom are being influenced by the Napoleonic ideas about nations. They begin to see themselves not just simply as, within a larger empire, but also within a larger empire, but of a sub-nation. Keep in mind places like Austria specifically, the Austro-Hungarian, as it eventually will be called, empire, is made up of a number of different states, cultures, religious movements. There's quite a number of different dynamics going on in the empire, and it's up until now, it's not had the same push and pull that it has after this point, because now all of a sudden you have the Balkans, or say the areas around then Bohemia, what we call the Czech Republic, and Slovakia and Slovenia. Those areas start to push and pull against the overall national narrative that Austria is trying to present, that it's a united country. Similarly, these things are going on all over Europe at the time. It would also become a cultural thing. Scholars and poets would scour folk tales and ballads to reconstruct a national past, to create something that builds on this commonality of culture, language, and history, to create political tools. You can see this in the way that the German country is fashioned out of the Prussian ideals that are then taken to sort of, in some aspects, create out of whole cloth a national identity for Germany, one that will drive Germany into the next century and into basically its destruction, if we're honest, in the way it's built up around the feudalism and what becomes eventually the Aryan ideals of purity and this concept of a pure national agenda built up on the German theory. In the second half of the 19th century, nationalism continues to reshape Europe, but not always in the form of grand unifications like Germany and Italy. From 1850 to 1890, another quieter force stirred, and this is what we call subnationalism. Subnationalism was the assertion of cultural, linguistic, and historical identity within a larger empire or nation state. These movements were not necessarily separatist in nature or independent in nature, but they were challenging the central powers by insisting that smaller peoples, regions, and languages mattered in the overall context. To go back to the example of Austro-Hungary, the Czechs were at the forefront of this movement. Intellectuals like, and I apologize in advance to anyone listening for the pronunciation I will have of names. Sometimes I get them right, sometimes I don't. I do try and check sometimes, and even then that doesn't help. But nonetheless, let's move on. So intellectuals like František Palky championed Czech history and autonomy within the Habsburg monarchy. In 1865, he wrote, "If the Austrian Empire didn't exist, it would need to be invented for the sake of Europe and humanity." His vision wasn't independence, but recognition and protection of Czech culture in a multinational state. Meanwhile, in Hungary, Lajos Kossuth had earlier warned of a centralized tyranny. Speaking in front of the Ohio legislature in 1851, he said the following: "The spirit of our age is democracy, all for the people, all by the people, and nothing about the people without the people. My nation will rise, called to resurrection by the eternal principles of the law of nature and nature's God. It will not lie in the grave longer than the holy number 3, and will require your magnanimity by becoming the cornerstone of national independence on the European continent." End quote. This was the moral code of subnationalist belief, that cultural identity should not be erased in the name of a greater unity. In Spain, Catalan intellectuals like Valentí Almoral laid the groundwork for modern Catalan nationalism, not through violence, but through cultural revival. In his 1886 book, Lo Catalanisme, he argued for Spain to recognize their uniqueness. Juan Main Falacour put it even more clear in the newspaper Diario de Barcelona. "Do you consider us brothers? Treat us as brothers on equal terms. Do not seek to impose your rights and your language on us, just as we do not seek to impose ours on you. Do you consider us a conquered country, entitled to impose our will by force, which is numbered, and by your own will? In that case, do not demand fraternal reciprocity from us." End quote. Catalanists wanted local governance and cultural rights, even as Spain pushed for centralization, and it was a bitter conversation and a bitter political fight. But they were not alone in this argument. Ireland, too, saw the rising tide of this cultural subnationalism, and in the Gaelic revival, spearheaded by figures like Douglas Hyde, sought to preserve the Irish language and tradition under British rule. Hyde famously declared in 1892, quote, "When we speak of the necessity of de-Anglicizing the Irish nation, we mean it not as a protest against imitating what is best in the English people, for that would be absurd, but rather to show the folly of neglecting what is Irish and hastening to adopt pell-mell and indiscriminately everything that is English simply because it is English." Something I think a lot of Welsh people would have some understanding for, especially in that period. Throughout Europe, these movements used history, folklore, language, and education to resist being absorbed into a larger, homogenizing identities. Railways and printing presses may have connected empires, but they also spread poetry, pamphlets, and patriotism in the local tongue. Some subnationalists believed in federalism, others in cultural autonomy. A few would later drift towards independence, but in this mid-century moment they shared a common conviction that being part of a state did not mean the death of the people's soul, which of course, as you may understand, brings us to Wales. Wales, with its ancient language, its long history of resistance and survival under English dominance, was fertile ground for these very national ideas. But Welsh nationalism didn't erupt in 1789 or even in 1848, the other big tipping point for a lot of European countries. Instead, it simmered slowly, shaped by religion, industrialization, and identity. We've talked at length about how Wales has conformed and transformed into different ways and means, how some of those that lived outside of Wales spent a lot of time relearning and understanding and developing the cultural milieu of Welsh thought. In fact, bringing it back to Wales and developing it into a modern sense, from Druids to Eisteddfods to all sorts of other cultural aspects and linguistic aspects. They were changing the way our society and the society in Wales worked. Specifically, when you look at Welsh language publications became much more popular in the 1800s. There was a lot more people reading them as well, which made a big difference. All of this stuff was shaped and transformed because of this thought process about what Wales is and what it should be. And because of that, we'll explore how nationalism took on a new, uniquely Welsh character, not through revolution, but through revival of language and of memory, and of the sense that Wales was not just a region of Britain, but a nation unto itself. By the 1850s, industrial Wales was booming. Coal from the south and the slate from the north turned towns like Merthyr Tydfil, Aberdare, and Blaenau-Vestfog into economic powerhouses. But amid this power, the Welsh language and identity was increasingly marginalized by the English-speaking state, as we've discussed frequently in this podcast. By 1847, government inquiries resulted in the publication of the three damning reports collectively known as the Treason of the Blue Books. These claimed that Welsh speakers were backward, immoral, and particularly targeted Welsh women. As one report said, quote, Welsh language is a vast drawback to the people and a manifold barrier to the moral progress and commercial prosperity of the country, end quote. The backlash to this, of course, as you can imagine, was fierce. The Blue Books galvanized cultural counter-movements. Writers and poets like Robert Jones Derfel and Ioan Gwynedd defended Welsh morality and traditions in print. Derfel published a satirical play entitled Brad I Lafrau Glasion, or The Treason of the Blue Books, in 1854, framing the report as a betrayal of by the British state. The Eisteddfod, which had seen periods of decline, was now revitalized. In 1861, the National Eisteddfod Association was formed to formalize this cultural institution as a platform for promoting Welsh language and literature. Women, too, joined the cultural defense. In 1850, the magazine I Gymraeg, The Welsh Woman, was launched to counter the misogynistic depiction in the Blue Books. These developments signaled a new phase of cultural nationalism, rooted in the idea that Wales had its own values, heritage, and future. Along with all of this cultural revival, there was a development within the churches themselves. Through verse and song, nonconformist chapels were fostering political change. Methodists, Baptists, and Congregationalists, who made up the majority of Welsh religious life, demanded social reform and religious equality, something that they've been doing for quite a long time. The chapels produced not just preachers, but politicians. They promoted the disestablishment, a campaign to sever ties between the Church of England and the Welsh state. Although the Anglican Church was an official state religion, it represented only a minority of the Welsh population. In Parliament, figures like Henry Richards, a pacifist and radical from Tregaron, became a key voice. He argued that Wales deserved recognition as a distinct political entity and that nonconformist values should guide moral reform across the UK. Speaking in 1870, Richard declared, quote, Wales has a nationality as strongly marked as any other under the sun. It is idle to suppose that this nationality will die out. Through figures like Richard, Welsh liberalism flourished. The party advocated for land reform, expanded education, and enfranchisement while resisting cultural assimilation. And that brings us to the Welsh nationalist movement. By the 1880s, a younger generation began advocating for a more assertive kind of nationalism. In 1886, the movement known as Cymru Fydd, or Young Wales, was founded. Its name echoed the pan-European youth nationalist movements like Young Italy or Young Ireland that were developing at the time. Cymru Fydd was founded in 1886 and spearheaded by a group of middle-class liberals and nationalists inspired by the Irish Home Rule movement. But it was David Lloyd George, a name which we'll be very familiar with in the next few years, a young and fiery MP from Carnarvon boroughs, who would become its most iconic figure. Lloyd George was only in his 20s at the time and believed that Wales deserved a greater say in its own affairs, not through violence or rebellion, but through constitutional change. Home rule for Ireland had already been debated. Why not Wales? As you can imagine, this would be a popular thought in amongst this group of people. The goals of Cymru Fydd were ambitious yet peaceful. They would campaign for Welsh home rule within the federal United Kingdom. They would promote the Welsh language and culture as a national treasure, not relics. Push for disestablishment of the Church of England in Wales. Expand education and support Welsh medium schooling. Encourage a sense of national unity amongst the Welsh people across regions and classes. Its tone was forward-looking, youthful, and idealistic, hence the name Young Wales. It attracted students, ministers, lawyers, writers, and teachers. There were local branches, public meetings, and a sense of excitement that Wales might finally define its own future. Lloyd George articulated the cause this way, quote, Wales has wanted aspirations of her own, which for too long have been ignored. The Imperial Parliament cannot possibly devote it the time and trouble necessary to legislate for each and every separate province. Cymru Fydd appealed particularly to growing Welsh middle classes in cities like Liverpool and London. It held public meetings, formed branches, and published nationalist pamphlets. The movement found an audience hungry for a stronger Welsh identity, particularly in the diaspora. But Cymru Fydd faced limitations. It was closely tied to the Liberal Party, which was a bit of a hindrance. It remained a movement of educated classes and had less influence amongst the working industrial classes in South Wales. In January 1896, a meeting was held in Newport that proved pivotal. Cymru Fydd leaders proposed integrating the movement with the Welsh Liberal Federation, giving it formal political backing. But South Walian liberals, as you can understand, especially those from the industrial and commercial backgrounds, balked at what they saw as a parochial nationalism. The Newport meeting then turned hostile, and opponents accused Lloyd George and Ellis of trying to divide the party, and of course the motion failed. This moment is often seen as the collapse of Cymru Fydd. The South's unionist and economic pragmatism and closer ties to England made nationalist aspirations seem unrealistic. Cymru Fydd soon dissolved, and Ellis tragically died in 1899. Though the movement itself did not achieve home rule and it fell apart, its legacy still endures to this day. It was the first modern attempt to blend cultural and political nationalism in Wales. David Lloyd George, of course, continued his political ascent, and by 1906 he was the leading cabinet minister, and by 1916 he was the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, as we'll talk a lot about during the World War I era. As Prime Minister, his Welsh roots still remained a central point to his identity, and he backed the Welsh Church Act of 1914, leading to the eventual disestablishment of the church in Wales in 1920. Many ideas championed by Cymru Fydd, the education reforms, the land rights, and cultural protection would shape later movements. The founding of Plaid Cymru in 1925 owed much to the groundwork that was laid by this earlier generation, and it's important to note that for every larger step into a different idea, a different modernization of our society, it has to start from somewhere. And it usually starts from what we would perceive to be relatively humble beginnings. And that's the thing I would caution with this kind of stuff, is that this is a humble beginning if you are a driver for or desiring the independence movement to succeed. But it is a beginning point. It is an establishment point. It is something that you can look back to and say, yes, this is where this all began. This is where this all came from. And these were the people who had influence. And what you'll note there as you look at it, and this will be a common discussion point throughout this history that we will talk about in the 20th century, is that most of these movements have started or at least gained strength in the north and then come south. And it's usually in the south where they have the most trouble, but it's also the south which has the most population. And you need the south in order to create this ideal that you want. In order to create what eventually becomes the Welsh Synod, you need at least the majority of the population to agree to it. And if you're going to go any farther than that, if you're ever going to go towards a independence movement, you need more than just a certain section of the population on board. And this is not a political discussion, but it's just something to keep in mind when we go forward talking about this, that there's a lot of commonality in how these groups have gotten moved and how and what is driving the movement. And as I said, we'll investigate that later on when we get into those movements. But for now, I'd like to thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, or just want to chit chat, you can do so at the Welsh History Podcast at gmail.com. If you have social media and you want to reach out to me on there, you can do so on most social media at Welsh History Pod, on Facebook at facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast. And hey, if you'd like to help this show continue to grow, you can do that as well at patreon.com/Welsh History. Thank you so much for your time today, and I hope you had a wonderful day. We'll talk to you again later. Take care. Bye-bye. Welsh History Podcast is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information on them, you can do so at evergreenpodcasts.com. Thanks for listening.